shortly after noon, Friday. As the assembled swarm of priests waited, they began to relax with the growing realization that the Galilean carpenter, who had undermined their authority for the past 3 years, was about to die. Meanwhile, Caiaphas sent several of his aides scurrying off with errands and messages. The temple guards who were minding Jesus sat down, inviting him to join them. That made Pilate anxious. He worried that he might lose control that he had struggled to achieve. He shouted over to Jesus, "Stand up, man, you are my prisoner and you do nothing unless I tell you." Jesus' intense concentration on the task before him had not wavered at any stage through the morning, and it did not change then as he stood up, followed by his embarrassed guards. Pilate was clearly pleased to have everyone in the courtyard looking at him and resolved to exploit this advantage. "Centurion," he ordered, "take this carpenter king and give him 39 lashes." The centurion and the 3 others marched swiftly away from Pilate and relieved the Jewish guards of their charge. Jesus was swept purposefully around the Praetorian wall and out of human sight. "Stay here and keep an eye on the opposition," I instructed Michael. I quickly caught up with Jesus. For the first time since the Garden of Gethsemane, he was struggling to keep his mind focused. Fears were taking over. He felt alone, and his faith in his Father's plan was clinging like a small crab clings to a rock in the face of advancing waves. "This is only pain," he reminded himself. "This is only physical pain. I've experienced pain hundreds of times. Every time I nicked my hand with a saw, every time I hit my finger with a mallet, this will be no different." And he prayed, "My dear Father, help me through this flogging. Help me to love these soldiers. You love them. You love their families. Help me." With similar thoughts repeating their messages around his mind, he tried to prepare himself as the soldiers routinely stripped him of his clothes and secured his tired body to a wooden flogging post. Human pain is something I've never experienced, but as the first lash of the studded whip fell on Jesus' bare back, a surge of anger and panic blasted through my mind. Clearly, I was still experiencing Jesus' human feelings. Whilst the soldier raised his arm in preparation for the next stroke, Jesus battled to sweep away his fear and find something to love in the man who was assaulting him. But the blows came too fast. He had no time to prepare himself for them. Before long, his back was a sodden mess of blood and torn flesh, and the state of his mind was little different. As the centurion counted the lashes, Jesus became calmer. It seemed that he was now barely feeling the repeated blows. His pain had reached some kind of limit. He was able to concentrate on his prayers again and began to sing a psalm within his mind, singing in rhythm with the regular splat of the blood-soaked whip. At 39, the centurion called a halt and gave instructions for Jesus to be untied. I gasped at it as he simply slid to the floor, his mind blank. Only his body was alive. A soldier strutted across the yard carrying something. "I gather he claims to be a king," he announced. "I've made him a crown." The man walked up to Jesus. In his hand was a thorn branch that he'd plaited into a hoop. The soldier crouched down beside Jesus' motionless body and paused. "He's out cold, sir." The centurion calmly gave an order. "Pour some water over him." This was done by a second soldier, and Jesus groaned. The 2 soldiers pulled him up and leant him against the flogging post. The first forced the barbed crown down onto Jesus' head, then bent down with his face close to Jesus and said, "Now you're a real king." I watched the man's mind. There was no hatred in his thoughts. Jesus looked into his eyes and saw an ordinary man who was trying to make a horrible job bearable. He just managed to say, "Thank you," before the other soldier struck him on the head with the water jug. Thorns dug deep into his scalp and his head fell back against the post. Jesus was barely conscious as the whole company of Pilate's private guard assembled in the courtyard to laugh at the prisoner. Herod's rope was draped over his shoulders, and the centurion watched as his men as they relaxed and enjoyed themselves for a few minutes. Then he gave an order for Jesus to be returned to the governor. Quickly and efficiently, the soldiers removed the cloak, poured more water over Jesus, hitting him one last time with the wooden jug, and then pulled his clothes back over that tattered back. As the son was half escorted, half dragged out of the stable yard, the weaver of the thorn crown called, "Hey, you've forgotten this!" He ran forward and placed Herod's cloak over Jesus' shoulders to a cheer from the assembled soldiers. That was the sight which interrupted the excited conversations of the Jewish priests as they waited in the praetorium courtyard. Pilate was standing in the same place, hands still clasped behind his back. Everyone looked at the blood-soaked prisoner, dressed in a royal robe and wearing a crown made out of thorns, unable to stand without the support of two young Roman soldiers. Governor Pilate was amused by his soldiers' work and taunted the Jewish council members, proclaiming, "Here's your king." "Take him away and crucify him," came the high priest's swift reply. Pilate laughed. "Do you want me to execute your king?" Michael drew my attention to the opposition leader, who was looking anxious. Lucifer could see, as we could, that the governor was making one final attempt to release Jesus. "The man is innocent and has suffered enough," he was thinking. Lucifer gave a simple single command, and the opposition spirits moved among the priests, stirring up jealousy and fear. The priests shouted venomously, "Take him away," and "We have no king." Then they returned to their chants of "Crucify, crucify, crucify." This time, their faces were twisted with rage. I heard an angelic voice behind me shout, "Shall we stop them?" I turned and saw an entire battalion of angels, numerous ranks of heavenly warriors, poised, waiting for a command to engage with their age-old enemy and save their Lord. Michael and I exchanged a momentary glance, and I addressed our army. "No one must take any action whatsoever without my express permission. Do you understand?" I returned my attention to the angry mass of chanting clerics to discover that the entire force of opposition spirits was staring at me in disbelief. None of them looked more confused than their leader. It lasted only a moment because the priest's chant quickly faded when they saw an execution party march into view from behind the governor's palace. There were 3 condemned men, each carrying his own cross, surrounded by a heavily armed troop of soldiers. They headed straight for Pontius Pilate. When they reached the governor, they stopped. Pilate remained where he was and spoke quietly to the soldiers in charge of the prisoners. I listened carefully. "Which one is called Barabbas?" Pilate asked. "The one in the middle, sir." "Release him." "Sorry, sir." "Release him, you idiot." "Yes, sir." The man looked across to the centurion, who nodded his agreement with the unusual command. He walked over to the second prisoner in the line, lifted the heavy wooden cross from his shoulder, and told him to leave. The undernourished terrorist moved from his place at the execution party, and a great cheer went up from the priests. At last, they were sure that they had won the day. The leader of the opposition, on the other hand, was still anxiously surveying the army of angels behind me. Jesus was escorted to the vacant cross, and it was lifted onto his shoulder. He struggled to take its weight. Lucifer's entire following closed in around their prize, and as the executioners continued on their way, Lucifer himself went to the front, taking his place beside the centurion. Michael and I, accompanied by our own battalion, brought up the rear with the priests. Governor Pilate did not even wait for the procession to reach his gate. He returned swiftly to the palatial comfort of his home. Outside the Roman army compound, the street was packed with people who'd come to see the spectacle. Clearly, Caiaphas's many messengers had been spreading the news of Jesus' doom. I scanned the faces in the crowd. There were a few scarred with hatred for Jesus, and a few distressed by his demise. Most of those gathered in the narrow street were there simply because they had nothing better to do and were attracted to the prospect of a celebrity execution. My studies of the human minds around me were interrupted. Jesus had collapsed under the weight of his cross, and soldiers were swarming around him. "He's not going to make it, sir," one was saying, and another added, "You'll have to commandeer someone to carry it for him." It was the centurion's turn to survey the crowd. I remembered one particularly bright face that I'd noticed, a young man who was full of hope. I directed the centurion's gaze towards him. The centurion responded surprisingly easily to my guidance and ordered the man to step forward. "Name?" "Simon." "Where are you from?" "Cyrene." "Where on earth is that?" "North Africa." "Are you a citizen of Rome?" Simon smiled at the absurdity of such a question being put of an African. "No." "Good." The centurion had been following the official protocol for forcing someone to carry a load. "Pick up that man's cross and follow us. It's less than a mile." Simon was ushered to Jesus' side, and the splintered cross was hoisted onto his shoulder. The crucifixion party moved on again, and I felt better for having done something to help. For hours I'd been watching helplessly, but at least I'd arranged for Jesus a sympathetic companion on his last earthly journey. As he staggered towards the place of his execution, Jesus' mind focused on the faces that lined his route. Deep in his thoughts, he was saying to each individual, "For you, and for you, for you." His eye especially picked out those who were screaming abuse at him, and to each his thought was the same: "For you." Then, without warning, Jesus stopped, causing considerable confusion among the soldiers. He stepped to the side of the road to speak to a group of widows dressed in their customary black. The centurion signaled to his men to leave Jesus for a moment while they helped themselves and Simon to a drink. The widows were professional mourners, women who attend funerals to lead the required wailing on behalf of the deceased family in return for a good meal. They'd been lending their rehearsed grief to the noise of the crowd. "Don't mourn for me," Jesus told them. "Weep for yourselves and your children." The centurion called for the death march to resume, and Jesus returned to his place. For the first time, he looked at Simon. Simon knew at once that he was not looking into the face of a common criminal. Jesus looked into young eyes that were bright with sturdy resilience on his Father's love. "Thank you," he said weakly. Simon was jabbed in the back by the blunt end of a spear and moved on. We made our way toward the city wall. Jesus was still fixed his attention on the people who lined his path. He seemed to draw strength from them. Not only did they provide a focus for his mind, but they became the focus of his entire purpose. The procession squeezed itself through one of Jerusalem's lesser gates and out into the midday sun. A short way beyond the city's fly-ridden refuse heap stood a small, bare hillock. At its rock-strewn summit, Simon was relieved of his burden and dismissed. Jesus stood and watched as experienced soldiers laid out the tools required for a crucifixion: hammer, nails, ropes. Jesus surveyed them with the eye of an expert, noting the weight of the hammer, the length of the nails. For a moment, these familiar objects filled his troubled thoughts until they were picked up and put to their dreadful purpose on the prisoner who'd been walking in front of him. The air was awash with curses and blasphemies as the man struggled, kicking and biting, until overpowered by the might of Rome. The bones in his wrist crunched as a large nail was driven through them and into the wood below. Hollow screams echoed through my spirit as this man who had lived for his own pleasure suffered the kind of agony that he had inflicted on others. My attention was distracted from the grisly scene by Michael, who directed my gaze at the sun. The leader of the opposition had moved right up to him and was gloating at him. What he was saying could not be reported in human language. Jesus ignored him, choosing instead to watch as the first prisoner's cross was hoisted upright and allowed to drop a considerable distance into a hole cut out for it in the rock. The man's body pulled at the nails which secured him and then crashed against the rough wood. He opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I imagined that the shock and pain were beyond expression. Large timber wedges were driven into the hole to secure the cross, sending shockwaves through the agonized body. When the hammer blows ended, the man unleashed a torrent of abuse against God, the Romans, and anyone else his eye noticed. The soldiers didn't stop to listen. They gathered up their tools and moved on to Jesus. Jesus was shaken by the sight he'd just witnessed. He'd seen men crucified before, but not from such close quarters, nor with the knowledge that his own body was about to be subjected to the same catalogue of agonies. He didn't resist as the soldiers removed all his clothes and laid his tattered back along the splintered wood. As ropes were secured around his chest and shoulders, Jesus looked into the faces of the hard-working Romans. "Father," he prayed, "forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." He smiled weakly at his executioners. 4 nails were passed across. Jesus prepared himself for a burst of pain as the point of the first nail was positioned at the base of his hand. I looked into his mind, deliberately ignoring the physical events around me. Jesus watched the nail, waiting, anticipating, and then crash. His mind lost all focus for a moment, spinning in dark terror. Then I heard the voice of Lucifer talking smoothly into Jesus' thoughts. "Curse God. Go on. Everyone does. It's only natural." Jesus turned his mind to the second nail, avoiding Lucifer's whispers. Another crash. This time he knew what to expect. The third and the fourth nails were driven through his ankles, and with these new pains added to the trauma of his earlier flogging, Jesus' brain began to drift at the edge of consciousness. When he was raised up above the square hole in the ground, the centurion stepped forward. "Gently, lads, gently." The cross was lowered rather than dropped. "I'll secure it, you do number 3, the centurion instructed. His men moved on to the third prisoner, and he pushed the wedges in with his feet, avoiding the terrible jarring that would have been caused by the soldiers' hammers. He then stood considering his unusual victim, still crowned with a wreath of thorns. Meanwhile, the last cross was erected. Its occupant perhaps had learned from Jesus' example. He didn't resist. The job done, the Romans packed away their tools and picked over the victim's belongings, looking for anything of value. They selected the hand-woven undergarment that Martha had given Jesus and decided to play dice for it. The crucifixion had been accomplished with typical Roman efficiency. Now there was nothing to do but wait. Wait for death. When the soldiers had finished their work, the crowd soon dispersed. There is little attraction, it seems, in watching 3 men slowly die. The members of the Jewish council returned to their families, and Caiaphas arranged for a rota of representatives to witness Jesus' end. "I don't want to take any risks," he said. "Send a messenger if anything unusual happens, and let me know when he is dead." With that, he returned across the valley to his wife and children. When their leader was out of sight, the remaining priests unloaded their frustrations on Jesus. It was a Jewish holiday, the day of Passover, and they were annoyed to be working. "You saved all kinds of people," they shouted at the now helpless adversary. "So they say. If you're our Messiah, chosen by God, why don't you save yourself? Then we can all go home." 2 of the soldiers joined in. "You're supposed to be a king," they jeered. "So where's your army? Aren't they going to ride in and rescue you?" I looked around at his army, now numbering many thousands of angels, crowded around their master. They could have overcome the Romans and taken Jesus down from that cross as easily as a woman picks fluff off her dress. But they did not. They were waiting, hoping for an order from me, and at that moment, I was sorely tempted to give it. A messenger arrived from the governor's office, carrying the charge notice to hang above Jesus' head. The men either side of Jesus each had their crime suspended over them. "Murderer," read the sign for the first. "Terrorist," said the other. The centurion reached up and passed the cord over the top of Jesus' cross. The notice proclaimed, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the priests stepped forward. "We can't accept that," he declared. "Not my responsibility," returned the centurion with a patient smile. "It's the governor who issues the charges." A second priest joined in. "Can't you just rub out 'this is' and replace it with 'he claimed to be'?" "I'm afraid I can't. Anyway, I don't have any chalk." This was, in fact, a lie. Human lies sound hollow to an angelic ear, and I suspect the small lump of rock that he was fingering in his leather pouch was indeed a piece of chalk. The priests stepped back, and one of them hurried off into the city to report to the high priest. The murderer on Jesus' right read the charge. "So you are our saviour, are you? Well, get on with your job and save yourself. And while you're at it, you can save me too." Painfully, Jesus turned to face the man, the spiked crown tearing into his scalp. But before he could speak, the terrorist on Jesus' left joined in. "Do you have no respect for your God," he shouted at the murderer, "or for your fellow sufferer?" He paused while a flash of pain shot through his own body. "You and I are here because we got what we deserved, but this man has done nothing wrong." The murderer simply spat. Jesus turned his head to face the first person to have spoken in his defence all day. He was a zealot, a member of a fanatical group dedicated to overthrowing Roman occupation and returning the Jewish people to the rule of law given by my boss. Jesus admired the self-sacrificing commitment of the zealots, even though he decried their murderous methods. He looked into the earnest eyes of a man prepared to die for his faith. The man spoke again, the hardness of his zeal tempered by imminence of death. "Jesus, remember me when you enter your righteous kingdom." Jesus struggled to reply. "I tell you the truth." He took several breaths before he could continue. "You will be with me in paradise. I was startled by Jesus' reply. Could a man of such violence be so quickly welcomed into my boss's home? I quickly looked across to Lucifer to see how he'd responded to Jesus' words. He was scornful, urging his minions to laugh at their enemy's foolishness. Time passed. The three men, the source of all love among them, were lost in their private agonies. The soldiers were prepared for a long wait. The two remaining priests were bored. A cold wind was blowing, bringing thick cloud to the Judean mountains.